as you get into the more active phase of labor and even pre-active phase of labor, as it's kind of ramping up, things get a little trickier and it becomes more necessary to breathe in a way that is working with those contractions instead of just relaxing through those contractions. Because during a contraction, the body is working. The body is working hard. It is doing purposeful, meaningful work. And so you want to move and to breathe in a way that helps your body to lean into that work. So as you start to enter the more active phase of labor, as the contractions become more challenging, you want to start to follow a pattern of, first, as you notice you have that contraction, in your mind's eye, greeting the contraction, saying, hello, contraction. That could be a little cheesy to some people, but in any way that you like, kind of greeting the contraction, acknowledging it being there, and then taking those breaths that are necessary to get through the contraction, focusing on the exhalation. Sometimes it can be helpful during those breaths to count the breath, because usually contractions, once they form a pattern, they can be the same. You're in the contraction for the same amount of time sometimes. And so you kind of start to get to know how many breaths out it's going to be for each contraction. So sometimes counting, sometimes vocalizing, and sometimes just letting it out with just letting it out with any type of breath that allows for a sense of release. And then after the contraction has passed, watching the contraction pass and acknowledging its passing, giving a little thank you. Again, if that feels cheesy, maybe not thinking those words directly, but acknowledging that it has passed and feeling even a teeny tiny bit of gratitude, acknowledging what your body is doing. So greeting, being in the contraction, and then acknowledging its passing, and then just kind of following that pattern. Hi everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Coffee Witching Hour. I'm so glad that you are here with me along for the ride. My name is Lacey, and this is my podcast that is all about yoga, birth, and raising kind humans. And today's episode is one that is by popular demand. I'm going to be talking today about breath for pregnancy and for birth. So we're going to be getting into all of the details of what types of breathing techniques to use during the various forms of, or during the various stages of labor, as well as during prenatal movement classes, or just any kind of general prenatal exercise class. We're going to be talking also about what types of breathing not to do that you may have heard of. So if you are expecting and would like to know how to breathe better for birthing and for relaxation, or if you are a birth worker and are curious about the different breathing techniques, then join us for today's episode. And before we get into all of the information, please go ahead and like this episode, go ahead and subscribe, support on Patreon, show some love, and we will get into it. Okay, so first, we're just going to be talking about what type of breathing not to do during pregnancy. So I mentioned this in my previous episodes about prenatal yoga modifications, which I'll link to in the show notes or the description. But some things that you want to think about avoiding during pregnancy are breathing in a way that contracts the belly inward forcefully. So we never want to be overdoing that engagement of the belly in towards the spine during pregnancy, because the energy is moving everything outward. So oftentimes you may be told that all types of breath work during pregnancy should be avoided in yoga classes, but this obviously is not true, and I'm going to be doing this entire episode mostly on types of breathing that are safe and are beneficial for pregnancy. But really you want to be avoiding forceful abdominal breath work. Anything like Kapalabhati, which is exhaling forcefully through the nostrils and bringing the belly in, or Uddiyana Bandha, which is drawing the navel in towards the spine. That's the type of breath work that you want to be avoiding, or long breath holds. So holding the breath out or in for long periods of time is just not really beneficial unless you had a really regular pranayama practice or regular breathwork practice before pregnancy and you're really comfortable doing those things, really you want to avoid doing it during your pregnancy. But this goes for all types of breath work that may be suggested by me or by another yoga teacher or even by a birth worker or a midwife or something like that. Anything that is suggested that makes you lightheaded or that makes you feel dizzy, anything like that, you want to avoid doing. You want to slow down and just return to your normal, natural breath. Additionally, if breath work or the thought of breath brings more anxiety and is not helping to calm you down, then you don't have to do it. You can always forget the breath altogether. And if you're doing a yoga practice, just focus on the movement, not focus on the breath so much. Because for a lot of people, breath work can be very anxiety producing. So if that is the case for you, just don't bother. Just think about something that does bring more calm instead. But I want to get into first the types of breath work that you can use for relaxation if breath work does feel like something that is relaxing for you. And if it doesn't feel relaxing right away, then give it some time. Allow yourself to get comfortable in it. Do it for a little bit. If it's feeling like something that is neutral or a little bit annoying but okay to do, then give it some time and just kind of notice how you're feeling both during the practice and after the practice. But different types of breath work for relaxation. Always the first breath work that I teach or cue during a prenatal yoga class is diaphragmatic breathing. You can also call this, for today's purposes, you can also call this belly breathing because that's what I'm really referring to here. Technically, diaphragmatic breathing is expanding the rib cage a little bit as well, which I will get into that a little bit in the breath for movement section of today's episode. But really what I mean when I'm talking about diaphragmatic breathing is just expanding and softening the belly. And that is really effective for relaxation. It's really effective for activating the parasympathetic nervous system, that rest and digest response. So really what you want to think of first and foremost is just allowing the belly to inflate with breath in and to soften back in with the breath out. Not doing anything crazy, not doing a really deep breath or a long hold or anything like that, but just bringing the breath lower down in the body. And sometimes it can be helpful to place a hand on the belly, maybe place the second hand on the heart, and just kind of watch as the belly expands and softens back in. So that can feel really relaxing for a lot of, not just pregnant people, but for a lot of people in general. So that is one that you can always return to at any point, as well as just returning to the natural breath. If anything that you're doing in a breathwork practice just doesn't resonate, just doesn't feel good for you, you can always return to diaphragmatic breathing. Another really powerful one for relaxation is kind of just sticking with diaphragmatic breathing, but extending the exhalation just for a beat. So I usually cue 4 breaths in, or 4 counts for a breath in and 6 counts for a breath out. Just kind of counting that at your own pace in your head. So inhaling to a 4 count and exhaling to a 6 count. And making the exhalations just a tiny bit longer than the inhalations with that diaphragmatic breathing allows for that natural relaxation response to occur. So allowing for an expansion of the belly, inhaling, and as you exhale, allowing it to be just a tiny bit longer. If numbers are not your friend and you feel like you don't want to count, you can always just kind of do it in your mind's eye, thinking of the intention of the exhale becoming just a bit longer than the inhalation. Another related one is 3-part breath. So there's kind of a myth out there that you're not supposed to be breathing into the chest at all during a yoga practice. It's all going to be in the belly, and that is not true. That's kind of what I mentioned about the ribs. There's going to be some natural movement in the ribs. There's going to be some natural movement in the chest as well. You don't have to necessarily avoid that. It can be nice, as I said, to practice those belly breaths just for relaxation purposes. But you can also think about inflating those other parts as well. So breathing in first to the belly, then to the ribs, and then a bit into the chest. And when you feel full, releasing first the chest, then the ribs, and last the belly. So that would be called 3-part breath. Similarly, this is what I was mentioning about the ribs. You can focus on just inflating the ribs with the breath in and breath out. And that can be really hard to do without some kind of feedback, either from placing your hands on the ribs, or what I really like to do is to take a strap around the rib cage, just above the belly, below the bra line, around the rib cage, and allow for the ribs to inflate 360 degrees as you breathe in and deflate 360 degrees as you breathe out. And that can be a really helpful exercise in visualizing that expansion 360 degrees, and also visualize that movement of breath into the ribs. So that doesn't feel good for everybody. So if it doesn't, you can always return to belly breathing. But using that strap, really powerful way of providing feedback for the places of the body that you don't usually breathe into. Because so often we hear that cueing, breathing into the belly, and people get really used to that, but they forget that there's all this extra space to breathe into as well, that we may not need to be breathing into all the time, but for a breathwork practice can be really interesting to explore that sensation of expanding through the back body and the side body with breath as well. So far we've talked about belly breath, extending the exhalations, 3-part breath, breathing into the ribs. Another really good one for relaxation is alternate nostril breathing. That's breathing in through the left nostril first, out through the right nostril, and then reversing it in through the right nostril, out through the left. You can either kind of do this with your hands to switch the breath, or you can, this is what I prefer, take the peace fingers to the bridge of the nose and switch from side to side. So switching from side to side, it's thought to be a balancing thing, balances the 2 hemispheres of the brain, balances the body. That's kind of the energy that breath work is going for. And this can be really nice to do before going to bed when you're just trying to calm the body down, find some balance. For some people, they don't like touching their face during breath work, and I get it. It's not for everybody. For some people, their nostrils are really stuffy, if you've got a cold or whatever. And so if that is the case, I instead recommend just envisioning the breath moving side to side, imagining that movement from side to side, and that kind of has the same energy of moving from side to side, of inviting that sensation of balancing in. A related practice is called moon breath, and that is moving the breath in through the left nostril and out through the right, and just repeating that. So in through the left, out through the right, in through the left, out through the right, just switching from side to side. And that's a related one, but it is one that is bringing breath into the left nostril. And so the left side of the body in yoga is thought to be the more cooling, feminine energy. And so that is thought to bring about more relaxation than moving it through the right side. Moving through the right side, that's called sun breath, and that can be really good if you want something that's really activating, which during pregnancy is not really the energy that we're often looking for. It's not going to hurt you to breathe in through the right side and out through the left, but what is more recommended during pregnancy is in through the left and out through the right, especially if you want to invite more relaxation into the body. But you can kind of feel what the breath feels like moving it side to side, and you can kind of feel what feels best in your body and what energy you are looking for. So those are kind of fun ones to play with as well. Another really good breathing practice for relaxation and for falling asleep is the one of counting the breath backwards, and that's kind of like counting sheep. And this is often part of a yoga nidra practice where, with your eyes closed, lying on a mat, being in this state of almost falling asleep, you're just imagining the breath moving backwards. It's in yoga nidra, we often start at 27 or 11. I don't know why those numbers are special ones. There's probably some kind of significance to those numbers. I'm not sure why really, but often those practices start at 27 or 11. If I'm trying to fall asleep at night, I usually start at 27, and it gives you a little bit more time to work backwards and allow the body to relax. But counting backwards from 27, each breath in is a count, each breath out is a count. So it would be inhaling 27, exhaling 27. Inhaling 26, exhaling 26. So it's kind of that same type of practice as counting sheep, except you're watching the breath in your body as well. And it invites, again, a feeling of relaxation, and it invites your mind to do something that feels a little bit repetitive and like it's not working too hard, but that it is capturing the mind's attention to allow for a sense of softening. The final type of breath work for relaxation, and there are so many, so this is not an exhaustive list, but this is just the final one on my list today, is also one that's a little bit of a visualization. This one is a pelvic floor visualization. So it's visualizing, as you're diaphragmatically breathing, the pelvic floor expanding with the breath in and softening back inward with the breath out. And that is what naturally happens in the pelvic floor anyways as you are diaphragmatically breathing. But inviting yourself to watch for that movement to draw awareness to the pelvic floor. You can also invite the imagery of a flower to that kind of visualization and imagine the pelvic floor to be a flower, expanding as you breathe in, softening as you exhale. So watching that movement can be really calming, can be really relaxing, and can invite some additional awareness to the pelvic floor as well. So a related practice is to make some noise as you are doing that pelvic floor awareness. And this is a little bit more of an active practice. So this is kind of more of one that you would do in connection with movement. Often I do this one in bird dog, which is on hands and knees, one arm reaching forward, the other arm reaching back, or in a supported squat where you can really feel the movement of the pelvic floor a little bit better. But this is called a shush breath, and it's letting the air out with a shh sound. And either adding a gentle contraction of the pelvic floor muscles at the base of that exhalation, or sometimes I skip that cue altogether because, as you know, people have different pelvic floors, and as yoga teachers, we don't know what's going on with people's pelvic floors. Sometimes contracting the pelvic floor is not what people need, just depending on what's going on there, and I never know what is going on there. So sometimes inviting, if they feel comfortable, that contraction of the base of the exhalation, or sometimes not. That is a cue that I offer more often in the supported squat, because you can feel a lot more of what's going on with the pelvic floor. Not so much in the bird dog variation, but it can be if people are kind of really have that awareness of the pelvic floor, and we've already been doing that cueing a lot. So it's exhaling with a shh sound. You can do that. You can also play with different sounds as you exhale, and it has kind of the same effect of naturally drawing the belly in, naturally drawing the pelvic floor muscles up and in as well. So it can be a sh sound, it can also be a s or a f sound. So you can just kind of get creative and play around with different sounds and kind of notice the effect on both the muscles of the abdomen and the pelvic floor as well. So another really popular one that I like to offer during movement practices, and if you practice any type of yoga, whether it is prenatal or not, you've probably heard of this one, but it's called Ujjayi breath. It's also called victorious breath, sometimes called ocean breath. But that is constricting the throat just a bit as you're breathing on both the inhalation and the exhalation. Sometimes this can be a helpful thing to do during pregnancy, especially if people had a regular yoga practice before pregnancy, because they're kind of used to doing that from vinyasa yoga classes sometimes. But it can also feel kind of weird and unfamiliar and not so helpful. So I always make it invitational. People can try it or not. But it is an intentional constriction of the back of the throat as you're breathing, and that's something that you want to do only during the active practices. It's not really as beneficial during the more passive relaxation practices. But as you're doing breath with movement, so as you're in a vinyasa flow type of situation, making that sound on both the inhalation and the exhalation. It's kind of the feeling of fogging up a mirror, where if you place your hand in front of your mouth, you can feel some warmth, but with the lips closed. So I'm not sure if you'll be able to hear it in the podcast, but it goes a little something like this. So it kind of sounds like Darth Vader breath, but you're doing it on both the inhalation and the exhalation. As I said, it's always optional. Sometimes people love it, sometimes people hate it, but that is one of the more movement-oriented breath practices. Another one of the more movement-oriented ones is a very simple cue, and it's found more in prenatal yoga than in regular yoga classes, but it's to exhale as you are in transitions. So as you are coming up to the top of the mat, or as you are pressing through the feet to stand, an exhalation, and that invites a lifting upward of the pelvic floor, a drawing inward of the core muscles, and it allows everything to be firm and grounded as you are making transitions, which is just really helpful and important during pregnancy when everything kind of feels like it is spilling outward. I think it's a little bit more of a Pilates cueing in origin than a yoga one, but you see it a lot more in prenatal yoga situations. So this next one is a little bit more technical, but I'm going to present it here and you can take it if it makes sense to you. But it's one that I really like to dig into during prenatal yoga classes. And that is, I think it's technically called thoraco-abdominal breathing. It's a little bit different from diaphragmatic breathing, but it is the one that people want to be using not only during pregnancy, but non-pregnant bodies as well, when people are in movement practices that require some exertion. It's kind of what people are naturally doing anyways during those movement practices, but you can kind of cue people into it to understand more of the technicalities around it. But it starts with just a simple diaphragmatic breathing, belly breath expanding, contracting, allowing that to be normal, natural. Once that starts to feel natural, to get into that kind of sensation of the thoraco-abdominal breathing, you cue them to exhale normally. At the base of that exhalation, keep the belly just as it was at the base of the exhalation, and then inhale. So you're not expanding the belly. You are keeping it firm. You're keeping that firm abdominal brace. So the core is just slightly engaged, not overly engaged, but slightly engaged. And that allows for the core to be engaged so that you can do different types of movement, like bird dog, or like things that require a little bit more abdominal engagement. Transitions, this is also helpful to have that kind of abdominal engagement during transitions as well. But it's the inhale to expand, exhale, and then at the base of that exhalation, you keep the belly firm and inhale into the brace of the abdominal muscles. And that's something that is kind of easy to get, sometimes not so easy to get, but it's kind of what naturally is occurring already during movement practices. So people are usually already doing it, but sometimes people like to have that information of the specifics of really how they should be breathing during the more active postures, and that's kind of it. Okay, so we talked a little bit about breathing for relaxation. We talked a little bit about breathing for movement. Those are some different types of practices that are helpful prenatally. I want to get into some of the breathing for labor and birth as well. And so all of those breathing techniques that I covered for relaxation, those can be used during early labor, because early labor, you really want to be thinking of softening the body. You really want to be thinking of bringing yourself into a state of relaxation. If you practice any kind of hypnobirthing, there will be all kinds of hypnobirthing exercises that are specific to bringing you into that state of relaxation, and a lot of them involve breath work as well. But doing any of those relaxing breath work practices are all appropriate for early labor. But as you get into the more active phase of labor, and even pre-active phase of labor, as it's kind of ramping up, things get a little trickier, and it becomes more necessary to breathe in a way that is working with those contractions instead of just relaxing through those contractions. Because during a contraction, the body is working. The body is working hard. It is doing purposeful, meaningful work. And so you want to move and to breathe in a way that helps your body to lean into that work. So as you start to enter the more active phase of labor, as the contractions become more challenging, you want to start to follow a pattern of, first, as you notice you have that contraction, in your mind's eye, greeting the contraction, saying, hello, contraction. That could be a little cheesy to some people, but in any way that you like, kind of greeting the contraction, acknowledging it being there, and then taking those breaths that are necessary to get through the contraction, focusing on the exhalation. Sometimes it can be helpful during those breaths to count the breath, because usually contractions, once they form a pattern, they can be the same. You're in the contraction for the same amount of time sometimes. And so you kind of start to get to know how many breaths out it's going to be for each contraction. So sometimes counting, sometimes vocalizing, and sometimes just letting it out with just letting it out with any type of breath that allows for a sense of release. And then after the contraction has passed, watching the contraction pass and acknowledging its passing, giving a little thank you. Again, if that feels cheesy, maybe not thinking those words directly, but acknowledging that it has passed and feeling even a teeny tiny bit of gratitude, acknowledging what your body is doing. So greeting, being in the contraction, and then acknowledging its passing, and then just kind of following that pattern. When you are in that contraction, so I mentioned a little bit about the types of breath. Earlier labor, you'll want to just be diaphragmatically breathing. Later in labor, vocalization is key. So the type of vocalization really, really matters here. If you are using a higher pitch, it brings more of the energy upward, and it doesn't allow for the body to bring the baby down in the way it needs quite as easily. So instead of higher pitched types of screaming sounds, you want to think of lower pitched sounds, almost like mooing, or it can be reminiscent of the om in yoga. So really low O sounds or ah sounds, kind of like moaning sounds, that's all good too. But allowing for that low sound to allow for baby to descend. So it's that energy of moving baby downward. One thing you don't want to do during labor, and this is something that I really don't hear about recently, but I think it's kind of more of a 90s thing of kind of hyperventilating during contractions. I know I watched some like really old videos during my mom's day of giving birth that showed people kind of going like crazy things like that. And that just kind of makes people hyperventilate. It doesn't help to bring baby down in the way that you want to. So don't do that. You can even kind of try to play with that, to practice it, to see how it feels until you become uncomfortable. But even after a few rounds of doing that type of breath, you might start to feel a little bit dizzy. You might start to feel a little bit lightheaded. So that's really not great to do, especially if you are in like 29 hours of labor or something like that. You don't want to be hyperventilating early on in the game. So that's breath for contractions, but breath between contractions is really, really just as important as the breath during contractions, because between contractions, your body's getting a chance to relax, to release all of that effort, to soften, to do all the things it needs to do. And you want your body to mirror that with breath as well. So breathing in any way that feels comfortable is definitely advisable, but also releasing the energy of that contraction with, it could be more vocalization, but could also be some horse breath, which is a flutter of the lips, sound. Just letting it go with a long ha or or a long sigh out, but allowing the breath to release, allowing the breath to release the body. That is really what you want to think of here. Pushing baby out is a different situation entirely and requires a little bit of a different breathing technique here. And I think it's a little bit unfortunate that people don't really practice for pushing until they're in it, because it is something that is not really intuitive for everyone. But pushing requires the feeling of bearing down, like the feeling of pooping almost. That's what a lot of nurses or midwives compare it to. But there are some technicalities in that. So if you are a hypnobirther, you might be told to breathe the baby down. And that is really helpful. It can be really, really helpful to have that in mind. But it's not entirely accurate. You can't just breathe the baby down. There's a little bit of effort that needs to happen. But you can think about that exhalation to bring baby downward. And you can think about the imagery that is sometimes in hypnobirthing to breathe baby downward as well. You can think of, with the exhalation, baby descending, the pelvic floor expanding, opening like a flower, all of that. That can be really, really, really helpful. But for most people, it's not just exhale to allow baby to descend. For most people, there's actually that feeling of holding the breath out, bearing down, pushing. And that's just what I've seen in my experience. I've never seen baby be breathed down all the way, and I haven't been able to do it on my own. But I do think that cueing in some sense is helpful, but a little bit inaccurate. So really what it is an exhalation, and then at the bottom of that exhale, pushing. And the pushing, it's really helpful to listen to the medical team in the room to kind of know both how hard to push and how not hard to push, depending on the situation, depending on if there are complications or things like that. If it gets to a point where the providers tell you not to push, if there's something going on with baby, like a shoulder dystocia or something like that, and they tell you to slow down, panting, literally like a dog, can be really helpful. That can also be helpful if you are a second-time birther or something like that and not getting to the hospital in time, and you are feeling the urge to push before providers are there or before you're at the hospital, things like that. Panting can slow down the descent of the baby. But for most pushing situations, it's an exhalation, at the bottom of that exhalation, bearing downward. And then if you are familiar with that yoga terminology, ujjayi. So that's when you are, the one time during pregnancy when you are bringing belly inward towards the spine, really in a big kind of ujjayi breath, is when baby is coming out of the body as you are pushing. So you don't practice ujjayi at all during pregnancy because it's not good for the body, but pre-pregnancy, you can practice ujjayi and think about belly drawing into spine, and with the base of the belly drawing into spine, opening through the pelvic floor and allowing baby to descend. Another helpful imagery or another helpful visualization is a J shape. So some people call it J breath. As you are doing the exhalation, bearing down at the base of that exhalation, thinking about the breath moving like a J. With a J meaning the breath is going down the body to allow baby to emerge out. The really, really one important thing here is that you do want to be breathing as you are pushing. So purple pushing is not helpful. Pushing until you turn purple, that's what purple pushing is. That is not really good for you as a birthing person. It's not good for the baby either to completely be losing air. So you want to think about taking little sips of air in between pushes. Usually each contraction, they're about 2 to 4, but usually about 3 pushes that you have to work with. And so during those pushes, little sips of air in, and then going into the next one. That is really helpful to stay in a sane place, to stay feeling like you have some power left in your body. Air is really important. Breathing is really important. So keeping it in mind during pushing, really, really, really important. And so, like I said, it's really hard to practice these breathing techniques during pregnancy, and you really shouldn't practice some of them during pregnancy, but you can kind of visualize practicing them. So you can visualize breathing in this way, and you can visualize it in a position that you could push in. So you could get into a squat and visualize that feeling of pelvic floor expanding, J breath, exhaling and bearing down, just visualizing, not actually doing it, but allowing for yourself to practice in that way. Squat could be holding onto a strap around a door frame or something like that, so you're supported as you're squatting, or holding onto a bar or something like that. You could also practice these positions in happy baby if you feel comfortable for any amount of time lying on your back, or in a supported happy baby kind of on a bolster, so that you get the feeling of breathing like that, envisioning the breath like that in a position that people actually give birth in. Or a side lying position with one leg extended, the other knee in towards the body. That's another pushing position that you can play with during the prenatal phase as well as hands and knees. That's another position where you can practice visualizing this birth for pushing, because like I said, it's not intuitive. Pushing baby out is not always intuitive. Second, third baby, however many babies you have, it may be. But for the first baby, you kind of need to be listening to the providers, but having some kind of framework to understand the pushing and being able to practice some elements of it before baby comes can be really, really, really helpful. So that's a little bit about the different types of breath for yoga practices, movement practices, for relaxation, and for the different phases of labor. And really, as I'm going through them, I'm realizing there are so many of them, and there are some that I'm thinking of now that I didn't even cover during this practice. Actually, my favorite one I didn't even cover. My favorite one actually is Kali breath, exhaling with the tongue out. Kali is the goddess of destruction, and she's a really fierce, powerful one during pregnancy, and I love to do it during every prenatal practice. So that's one that's more movement oriented, but you can also do that Kali breath between contractions or just to release energy, release stress and things that you're holding in the body. Anyways, I should stop myself now because there are just so many different types of breathing techniques that you can work with during pregnancy to prepare for bringing baby into the world, to prepare for labor, all of those things. And all of them are really, really, really important. And not all of them will work for everybody. So being able to play around with some of these can be so helpful. Now that I'm thinking of it, I should just film a whole class that is just breath work for pregnancy and for labor and for birth, so you can see some of these things being demonstrated. But I'll leave it at that for today. I do hope that you got something out of it. I hope that you were able to visualize all of the different types of breathing for the different parts of pregnancy and labor and all of that. And I think I'm going to create a blog post to go with it so that you have something to refer to, so you can remember all of those many ones that I mentioned in today's episode. If you found today's episode helpful, please do like the video. If you're watching on YouTube, subscribe, rate 5 stars. If you are listening on Spotify or any type of other podcast format, support on Patreon, do all of those things, and let me know what you'd like to hear more of next time. Thank you so much for being here today, and I will see you soon.